tell you about the exact moment I stopped trusting the official timeline. It wasn't a shocking document or a secret file. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was looking at an architectural survey of a mid-18th century European building. The official historical record confidently describes it as a simple customs depot. But as I stared at the faded ink, I noticed a detail that made absolutely no sense. The ceiling clearance of this supposed customs depot was an astonishing 60 feet. 60 feet of empty, vertical space for a society running on horse-drawn carts. Why would men with simple ledger books need horizontal spans of 50 meters? Let's look at the actual specifications of a standard 18th century transport. A typical horse-drawn cart requires no more than 10 feet of vertical clearance. Yet the blueprints show massive vaulted archways designed for something much larger. You don't build unsupported 50-meter spans for simple agricultural storage. The engineering required for this level of structural integrity is extraordinary. In a true warehouse, you optimize for vertical storage and closely spaced walls. These old buildings deliberately optimize for vast lateral access and open skies. That is not the layout of a warehouse. That is the exact blueprint of a hangar. And yet, regional surveys of the period list these structures under vague titles. They call them civic pavilions or municipal halls. Generic labels hide the truth. The official narrative simply collapses the moment you look closely at the math. Our accepted history is a comfortable illusion, and this depot is the first crack. Let's step outside this impossible structure and look closely at the outer walls. The massive stone facades are hiding a truth kept in plain sight for centuries. Look at these enormous forged iron rings embedded deep within the masonry blocks. Academic historians comfortably label these heavy metal fixtures as horse hitches, a reasonable explanation, until you notice their actual placement on the building. These heavy, mooring rings are not at ground level where a horse would actually be. They are mounted at roof height, 4 stories up, facing outward into an empty sky. Unless horses of the 18th century could fly, the official narrative is dead. Who exactly was tying their carriage to an iron anchor 15 meters in the air? We are looking at mooring anchors designed for massive vessels arriving from above. The entire architectural focus of this grand building is not directed at the ground. It is angled upwards, deliberately reaching out to receive something from the clouds. Look at the sweeping, perfectly flat approach corridors extending from the entrances. Modern tour guides confidently call these vast spaces traditional market squares. But traditional market squares are enclosed, sheltered, and scaled for human trade. These spaces are clear glide paths, precisely graded for massive aerial arrivals. They perfectly match the required approach angles for high-capacity airship docking. The infrastructure is too deliberate, too coordinated to be a random design mistake. The pattern repeats with a terrifying precision across these impossible structures. Once you see this aerial transit network, you can never unsee it. We were not alone. If you are tired of the comfortable academic fairy tales we are fed, then consider subscribing to this channel. We are just starting to dig. Join the investigation. The truth is buried beneath layers of official lies. Let us cross the ocean to North America, long before the Revolutionary War. We find massive colonial structures, officially labeled as civic pavilions, dated to the 1760s, built by struggling early pioneer settlers. Yet they display the exact same architectural vocabulary as the European hubs, the very same vaulted ceilings, the exact same 50-meter lateral clearances. And there they are again, the identical heavy mooring rings facing the sky, placed at the exact same vertical elevation as the ones found in Great Britain. We are asked to believe that isolated colonies built identical giant structures. Mainstream historians dismiss this global architectural alignment as coincidence, but you do not accidentally build the exact same specialized transit terminal. The communications technology of the 1700s simply did not exist. The complex engineering knowledge was not shared across the dangerous ocean. How do you build the exact same highly technical building on two continents? The pattern repeats with terrifying precision. The coordination is undeniable. These so-called pavilions were designed to receive the exact same airships. The official explanation collapses here. The timeline is completely shattered. This was a unified global network, and its remnants hide in plain sight today. So how do you hide a massive global network of empty aerial terminals? You do not tear them down. You simply wait for a primitive technology. Welcome to the 1840s and the arrival of the steam locomotive. Suddenly, all these giant civic pavilions were miraculously repurposed. Official historians claim these buildings were constructed for trains, but the official historical timeline contradicts itself with pure honesty. Just look at the foundation stones of the earliest grand railway stations. The dates, carved in stone, predate commercial steam engines by decades. Why would a town build a massive train station before inventing trains? They didn't. They simply laid iron tracks into existing covered hangars. The primitive locomotives fit perfectly into these colossal open spaces. 50 meters of horizontal clearance is quite convenient for train tracks. But notice the soaring ceilings. Steam trains never needed that height. In fact, the high vaulted roofs trapped deadly toxic smoke inside them. A logical architect designing for steam would have planned for ventilation. These roofs were sealed, built to shelter massive floating airships. The original architecture remains largely intact under minor alterations. The original true function of the structure is seamlessly overwritten. The archive closes around the comfortable lie like water around a stone. Let us examine the very earliest photographs from the 1840s. The official history says that the sky in these images was completely empty. But if you look closely at the backgrounds of these early urban panoramas, you will find strange, elongated shadows hovering above the station roofs. Academic archivists confidently dismiss these shapes as emulsion defects. They tell us these are just simple scratches on the fragile glass plates, but a random chemical defect does not have perfect symmetrical geometry. A scratch on a lens does not feature a suspended gondola underneath it. These exact same anomalies appear in images from Paris, London, and Boston. Why do these processing errors cluster exclusively over transit terminals? Notice how this dark cigar shape aligns perfectly with the mooring rings. The history books say steerable airships were invented much later in time. Yet these detailed photographs were taken decades before those inventions. These vessels are holding fixed aerial positions against strong crosswinds. You can actually see the faint outlines of structural ribs in the shadows, which explains why so many original glass plates have mysteriously vanished. The skies in the modern digital archives have been heavily scrubbed clean. Only the forgotten physical prints in private collections show the reality. The sky of the 1850s was not empty. It was filled with traffic. The official narrative is crumbling, and the ghosts in the sky prove it. So how does a global atmospheric transit network just vanish from history? The academic consensus demands that we believe in a linear progression, from horses to steam to early flight, a neat and comforting fairy tale. But the timeline has a massive crater in it, a period of profound amnesia. You might have heard a forbidden word whispered in the margins: Tartaria. Official maps from the 1700s show it as a vast Asian empire. But Tartaria was never just a political boundary drawn by old map-makers. It was the name of the unified technological standard of the Old World, a civilization defined not by borders, but by shared atmospheric logic. When the Great Reset happened, that knowledge was systematically fractured. Let us look at the famous Montgolfier brothers in the 1780s. History hails them as the grand inventors of the first hot air balloons. Look at their designs: flimsy paper bags filled with primitive fire smoke. Does a society that builds 50-meter stone hangars fly in paper bags? The Montgolfiers did not invent flight. They were engaging in a cargo cult. They were desperately trying to recreate the erased technology of the past. Now, look at the early 1900s and the birth of the great Zeppelins. Count von Zeppelin did not pull his incredible designs out of thin air. He was simply the first industrialist to successfully reverse engineer them. He looked at the old anchor rings and finally built something that fit. Let us now turn our attention to the vast, empty expanses of Central Asia. In the 19th century, British and Russian mapmakers arrived in force. They expected to find nomadic tribes living in the untouched, barren steppes. Instead, their private expedition diaries recorded something impossible. They found cyclopean ruins rising directly out of the freezing wasteland. Massive stone foundations that stretch for miles across the empty plains. The official academic records neatly categorize these as unknown origins. The word unknown is the ultimate shield for a lazy historical narrative. If you label a giant structure as a mystery, you never have to explain it. But the military cartographers measured the exact dimensions of the ruins. They found geometric drainage systems engineered into the frozen bedrock. These dry zones form perfect rectangles, kilometers long and perfectly flat. To modern eyes, these rectangular clearings look exactly like landing strips. They are precisely graded to handle the arrival of massive aerial vessels. Why would any nomadic horseman need a 3-kilometer horizontal clearing? The simple answer is that the nomads did not build these transit corridors. They merely inherited the silent, broken infrastructure of a ruined world. Look closely at the surviving sketches hidden in the Royal Archive vaults. You can see the familiar mooring rings scattered in the Siberian permafrost. The global transit network did not just cover cities, it spanned the globe. Let us leave the frozen steppes and travel to the Spanish colonial empire. Hidden in the jungles and old cities are massive administrative centers. The official history claims the Spanish built these as simple tax offices. But the Royal Archives in Seville tell a completely different dark story. Look at the original colonial budgets for these mundane provincial buildings. Massive fortunes were spent specifically on reinforcing the flat roofs. The engineering calculations for the roof structures are simply absurd. Their load-bearing capacity exceeds the weight of clay tiles by 100. Why would a simple tax office need a roof capable of holding 50 tons? They installed dense iron support columns directly beneath the top floor. Modern historians vaguely suggest this was to protect against heavy rains. But you do not need military-grade structural engineering to deflect rain. These flat roofs were not designed merely to keep the harsh weather out. They were designed to withstand the crushing weight of a landing airship. You can still find deep mechanical indentations carved into the masonry. Local, indigenous legends speak of giant skyships arriving from the east. The Spanish Church quickly erased these accounts as pagan hallucinations. But their architectural footprint matches the European hubs perfectly. The global transit grid did not ignore the wealthy colonies of the South. It simply hid its heavy docking infrastructure under the guise of the crown. How do you hide a complete global transit network from all of humanity? You cannot simply demolish thousands of heavy cyclopean stone structures. So the new ruling institutions employed a policy of aggressive erasure. Let us look at the bizarre architectural phenomenon called the mud flood. Across the world, 19th century buildings share a strange anomaly. Their ground floors are buried deep beneath meters of solid, packed earth. Official history claims our ancestors built basements with full windows. But no rational architect buries massive stone entryways into the dirt. The mud flood buried the lower infrastructure of the old world transit. What could not be buried by the mud was conveniently erased by the fire. Consider the staggering number of great urban fires in the 19th century. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 supposedly started with a single clumsy cow, a highly convenient fire that melted solid stone and erased old archives. But the most cynical act of institutional erasure was the World's Fairs. The Chicago Columbian Exposition featured colossal, ancient architecture. We are told these massive neoclassical hubs were just temporary plaster, built in mere months by men with horses, only to be demolished right after. They showcased the inherited old world tech and then blew it to pieces. They burned the remnants, buried the foundations, and rewrote the books. The institutional silence we hear today is built entirely on ashes and mud. Let us bring all the scattered pieces of this impossible puzzle together. We have seen massive 50-meter stone hangars disguised as customs depots. We have found heavy iron mooring anchors mounted 4 stories in the air. We have witnessed perfect aerodynamic glide paths labeled as market squares, and we have seen the dark silhouettes hovering in the earliest photographs. The official timeline demands that the skies of the old world were empty. It demands we believe our ancestors stared up at nothing but clouds and birds. But the surviving architectural evidence screams a very different reality. The 17th and 18th centuries were connected by a global grid, a unified transit network that moved heavy cargo and people across oceans. Then came the catastrophic event that modern researchers call the Great Reset, a deliberate systemic collapse designed to wipe the slate completely clean. The atmospheric hubs were violently grounded, buried in mud, or burned down. The survivors of this global reset inherited a shattered, disconnected world. They woke up in the ruins of a golden age with profound technological amnesia. And the new ruling institutions handed them a comforting, primitive story. They were told they had always lived in the dirt, relying on horse-drawn carts. They were taught to look at the glorious ancient architecture and feel small. The official history is not just wrong. It is a carefully engineered cage. The illusion ends here. Now, it is time to look at the cold, hard analytics. Theories are comfortable, but numbers do not lie. Let us look at the hard data. We compiled the demolition records from 1890 to 1950 exact. A coordinated, global campaign systematically erased the old infrastructure net. Consider the original Pennsylvania station in New York, an absolute masterpiece. It was a colossal transit hub, featuring vaulted ceilings of impossible scale. In 1963, they violently tore it down and threw it in a swamp. They replaced a cathedral of transit with a dark, suffocating concrete basement. This was not an isolated, tragic loss. It was a calculated, global protocol act. Let us calculate the metrics of the great mud flood excavation worldwide today. Digging out the ground floors of these massive buildings required huge logistics. The conservative estimate is over 400 million tons of manually moved earth. Now, look at the high-altitude mooring rings and massive iron anchor points we saw. We tracked thousands of miles of heavy iron chains and masts melted down as scrap. The new industrial age fed its early, dirty factories with the bones of the old. But physical destruction is completely useless if the architectural records live. How many original construction blueprints from the 1800s actually exist? Hundreds of thousands of municipal archive folders were quietly incinerated then, lost in tragic fires, flooded in basement accidents, or simply declared missing. Millions of tons of earth, endless scrapped iron, and burned paper trails to nowhere. This is not natural urban development. This is a military-grade scrubbing operation. Out of thousands of massive aerial hubs, less than 2% survived. 2% is all that remains of the unified global transit network. The rest were intentionally systematically deleted from our shared reality. Look around your modern cities today at the ugly glass and steel boxes. We are told this is the absolute peak of human architectural evolution. But imagine if the Grand Reset had never occurred in the 1800s. Imagine our modern skylines integrated with these colossal stone terminals. Giant airships silently docking at perfectly preserved high-altitude rings. No toxic concrete highways, just clean and silent atmospheric flight today. A completely different timeline where humanity never forgot how to look up. Instead, we walk with our heads down, staring at small, glowing rectangles. We step over the buried windows of our ancestors without asking any questions. We dutifully memorize the sterile timelines printed in government textbooks, and we ignore the massive iron anomalies bolted directly above our heads. The academic gatekeepers will continue to call them horse hitching posts. They will continue to dismiss the photographic ghosts as chemical defects. But the absolute truth requires no validation from the official consensus. The impossible buildings are still here. The heavy iron anchor rings weight. Somewhere between their lies and the quiet stones lies an erased world. What exactly did they see when they looked up at the skies of the old world?